Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Let's talk about some Week 12 wide receivers. And with Buymageddon week number 1 here, with 6 teams on a bye, we're going to be digging deep, trying to find some players that can help us get through this. And hopefully in this video, we'll be diving deep enough into enough players that you'll find a few guys that you could pick up off the waivers, or maybe utilize that you haven't yet so far this season to make sure that you get through this week with a victory and keep marching towards the playoffs. And the weather in Cleveland for Thursday Night Football is not supposed to be great. So how is that going to affect George Pickens, Cedric Tillman, and the rest of the guys that we may be looking at? This Cleveland defense is currently allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game and receiving touchdowns to the wide receiver position. And George Pickens has shown an increased upside since Russell Wilson took over. So this looked like a perfect matchup for George Pickens. But now we got to question that a little bit, especially with the impending weather coming in. As of this recording, there's really not a whole lot of guaranteed to happen with that weather. So we need to continue to keep an eye on it. And then leading up to game time, maybe we just need to knock our expectations back on George Pickens just a little bit. But quite honestly, the weather makes him a low risk to medium risk, but definitely not benching him. This is the 2nd straight week that Cedric Tillman, Elijah Moore, and Jerry Jeudy have each had 8+ targets. Then you got to factor in that David Njoku is also getting 6, 7, 8 targets per game as well. That's a lot of targets to consistently be going around for somebody to find a very safe floor every single week. We saw it this past week. Cedric Tillman had really been that big play guy for this offense. And then he didn't end up getting those plays going up against the New Orleans Saints, who have had trouble in their secondary. He kind of disappeared. And that's why the floor on all of these guys are really low right now. But with 8+ targets a game, it leaves some opportunity for some decent upside. But going up against the Pittsburgh defense in the weather may not offer that much upside this week. That's now 2 games this season that the Chicago Bears narrowly let slip through their fingers. Can they get it done this week against Minnesota? Their defense is really trying their best. The Bears secondary is allowing the 7th fewest receiving yards, 3rd fewest points per game, and the 2nd fewest touchdowns to wide receivers so far this season. Justin Jefferson is always a good bet to find his floor each and every week. Now, Jordan Addison is really the biggest issue here in this matchup because of how tough this secondary is. When you take a look at Justin Jefferson, decent floor, even if the ceiling is a little bit limited. But Jordan Addison's ceiling is lower than Justin Jefferson, and his floor is lower than Jefferson's as well. I will admit, I'm probably liking DJ Moore and Rome Odunze a little too much this week. Minnesota is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. They're tied for the 5th most touchdowns allowed to them and the 5th most receiving yards as well. Rome Odunze has kind of been the lead target getter the last couple of weeks here with Caleb Williams, and DJ Moore had a decent bounce back last week after some poor performances. But this week going up against Minnesota, I like them both so much, I'm willing to run on over to Underdog and take a look at their projections and go higher than both of them. Because right now, Rome Odunze is set at 43.5 receiving yards, while DJ Moore is at 45.5. This matchup is way too good at home to pass on such low projections, because both of these guys could easily hit 50 yards and not even have that big of a day. So I'm definitely willing to lock both in over their projections currently over on Underdog and start slating them into some of my tickets. Indianapolis is currently allowing the 8th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers, and now they're going to have to face off against Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams, who are coming off huge weeks last game. Amon-Ra is now up to the wide receiver 2 on the season and has a touchdown in 8 straight games. And while Jameson Williams is not seeing a ton of consistent targets, he's got big playability, and no matter where he's at on the field, he can take it to the house. Amon-Ra St. Brown is super safe. Jameson Williams is a little bit more risky for me, though, because if Detroit ends up blowing Indianapolis out of the water, just like they have done other opponents this season, Jameson Williams may not see enough consistent targets throughout the game to make sure that he has a decent floor. But of course, it only takes one target to reach his ceiling. Josh Downs is clearly the wide receiver 1 in this offense. And last week when Anthony Richardson became the starter, tons of comments about wanting to forget about Josh Downs, and he was no longer an option. And I tried to tell all of you, even with Anthony Richardson, he's had some really good games this season, and he ended up putting another one together. This week, going up against a Detroit secondary that allows quite a bit of receiving yards, but typically gets some decent stops, Josh Downs to me is a safe bet. And over on Underdog, I'm taking a look at his current projection of 59.5 receiving yards because he's gone over that mark in each of his last 3 games. He definitely has a really good opportunity to go over that mark this week going up against Detroit. Maybe the touchdown won't be there, but the volume will be. Michael Pittman may end up being the number 2 target. To me, when I take a look at Michael Pittman, medium type of risk this week because Indianapolis more than likely will be trailing. Alec Pierce is kind of the X factor. He's definitely a high risk because he may only get 3 or 4 targets, but if he really were to take one of those to the house, then he can end up having a solid overall day. But you're basically expecting one big play or one big touchdown to make his entire value. This could end up being a little bit of a tougher matchup for Demario Douglas, but given the fact we have so many teams on a bye this week, and Demario Douglas has had a pretty decent floor all season long, I do look at him as being another startable option if you're vying for some type of depth in your lineup. And in this matchup, his ceiling is not going to be super high, but he typically sees enough targets and puts together enough yards to give you some wide receiver 3 type value. Tyreek Hill now has touchdowns in back-to-back games. He hasn't quite reached his ceiling since Tua returned, but going up against a Patriot secondary that can give up quite a few yards to receivers, maybe he's got a little bit more big play ability this week and we do end up reaching that ceiling. Even if he doesn't, still a safe bet. I'm going to have him in my lineup, but for right now, Jalen Waddle is a guy that I'm going to kind of pass over. In this offense, he should be putting up bigger numbers, but Jonnu Smith is kind of working his way into that number 2 target conversation for this offense. And if that happens, Waddle could be finding some issues giving you the type of value you need down the stretch. Jalen Waddle has not finished higher than wide receiver 35 all of the way back in week 1. So if you drafted him or are hanging on to him, it's probably best to maybe give it a week or 2 and then think about cutting bait if he still hasn't turned it around at that point. Let's be cautiously optimistic about Mike Evans because he hasn't even been cleared to return to game action as of yet. He practiced last week and he's practicing this week, but there's no word on whether or not he will play. So as of right now, he's going to be a medium risk. It's not the easiest matchup in the world, but he's hunting for another 1,000 yard season and he's going to have some big games down the stretch to make that happen. So don't be shocked if they don't force him the ball a little bit more often. Tampa Bay's defense is inside the top 10 most fantasy points, touchdowns, and receiving yards allowed to wide receivers right now. So this is a really good matchup for both Malik Nabers and Wan'Dale Robinson, even with Tommy DeVito being the starting quarterback. Am I going out on a limb by saying both of these guys are low risk? Maybe, but DeVito's going to have to throw the football this week, and he's going to go to his top 2 targets more times than not, and Tampa Bay secondary is definitely willing to give up some big plays. CeeDee Lamb had a solid day last week. It's not going to be the wide receiver 1 numbers that we're used to, but he's not completely irrelevant with Cooper Rush either. Washington's secondary has been playing much better than it did at the beginning of the season, so the numbers still seem to suggest this is a super easy matchup, when in reality, it really isn't. CeeDee Lamb, I'm willing to roll with him. We just have to know that he's not going to win us any more weeks for the rest of the season. And I know Turpin had the big play last week for a touchdown, but I'm not banking on that. The guy only had 3 targets. Terry McLaurin had 5 straight games as at least a wide receiver 2, and he's been a wide receiver 2 in every single game except 1 since week 3. So he's been giving you consistent fantasy numbers while also showing you a little bit of upside as well. So if you're still freaking out about the bad game that he gave you last week, it's called laws of average. That's just what happens sometimes. He's been playing really, really well. He had a bad game, and now going up against Dallas, he has a chance to get right back on track. I definitely have some concerns this week about the pass catchers for Kansas City. Number one, if Kansas City ends up blowing Carolina out early, you're not going to see a whole lot of passing in the second half. DeAndre Hopkins is going to be the number one wide receiver, and he carries a medium risk because of his target share. Xavier Worthy, for me, is going to be still a little bit too big play dependent in a game where he's not going to see a whole lot of volume if Kansas City is winning. Number two, keep in mind Isaiah Pacheco could end up coming back this week. So with him and Kareem Hunt healthy, you got to wonder if maybe Kansas City just runs the football a little bit more than what they usually do if this game is a solid lead for them. And of course, number three, don't forget Travis Kelce, because this is a really, really good matchup for him, and he could take away from these guys. Unfortunately, the Carolina wide receivers are going to find themselves as my Mando must-avoid wide receivers for the week. Xavier Legette and Adam Thielen are two guys that I'm staying away from. This is not the greatest matchup in the world for them in terms of volume. Fantasy points are okay at times because Kansas City does allow quite a few receiving touchdowns, but really they're not allowing a whole lot of receptions, receiving yards, and fantasy points to the position still. A lot of you are probably looking at Adam Thielen as a decent start this week given all the buys. He's coming off IR. He was probably readily available to pick up, but I'm probably going to say no, not going with Adam Thielen in this matchup this week. And Xavier Legette is just way too big play dependent for me, and even though Kansas City is allowing a decent amount of touchdowns, I don't know if he's going to have the volume overall that I want to chase. And with the fantasy playoffs right around the corner, we're all going to be sweating our fantasy lineups consistently for the next few weeks. So head on over to Shop Mando and pick up their new starter pack, which you can get for almost 40% off by using code word headliners at checkout. Mando has a clinically proven formula that can eliminate odors for up to 72 hours. So when you're sweating your lineups from Thursday night through Monday night, you can have a little bit of extra protection to go with it. Calvin Ridley's value had been surging up over the last few weeks, but this week he had his lowest target share since week 4. And because of that, we didn't see nearly the type of volume or upside that we had become accustomed to and what we were hoping for down the stretch. Going up against Houston, we may see some of that bounce back, and we do have some big play potential with Calvin Ridley as well this week. But it's all about Will Levis. Is he going to have problems, or is he going to be able to get the ball to Calvin Ridley consistently? And for NWI, I don't know. Maybe you want to try and throw him in there as a deeper option. He's been scoring touchdowns this season, but it was one big play last week that made his entire week overall. CJ Stroud just doesn't look very confident right now, which is unfortunate because of how well he played last season and the aspirations of this Houston team in 2024. Last week could have been an even bigger week if it hadn't been for that Nico Collins touchdown getting called back. But that's where my concern becomes. This is a tougher matchup, and with the way CJ Stroud has been playing, is he going to be able to consistently get the targets to Nico Collins? Also, Nico was still coming on and off the field a little bit more often than we would like last week. That hamstring may not be 100%, and maybe he's a little limited this week as well. So for right now, he's going to carry a little bit of a medium risk for me. It took a little bit of time this season, but Courtland Sutton is on a roll right now, and he's been pretty big for our fantasy rosters over the last few games. He has at least 70 receiving yards in each of his last 4 games, and he has 38 total targets over that stretch as well. Now, the numbers for Las Vegas make it look like it's really difficult to pass against them, but that's not really the case. They're not getting into a whole lot of shootouts, and teams are running the ball against them, so the numbers don't look all that great. But Courtland Sutton could be in for a really solid game once again. The Denver Broncos are still allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. And for Jakobi Meyers and Trey Tucker, there's just not a ton of value in really difficult matchups like this. Yeah, they could end up seeing decent volume throughout the rest of the season because, well, Las Vegas just isn't that good, and they're going to be throwing the ball an awful lot. But trying to rely on them in a week like this, going up against such a strong defense, even with as many buys as we're facing, I feel like you should be looking elsewhere. One question we're waiting to be answered this week is going to be George Kittle, because his status on the field actually is really going to affect how I think about these wide receivers. Because right now, Deebo Samuel and Jauan Jennings are both medium risk players this week. If George Kittle comes back, he goes to low risk because he's the number one target on this team a majority of the time. And then these guys are going to stay at medium risk, because this is definitely a game where San Francisco is going to need to throw the ball a little bit. But if for some reason George Kittle ends up going out, Jauan Jennings becomes a low risk, because a lot of those targets that Kittle gets, they end up going to Jennings. And then Deebo will stay at a medium risk as well. Deebo just doesn't have a ton of upside for me right now, especially with Jennings getting so many looks from Brock Purdy, and of course Christian McCaffrey being back. This is going to be a tough matchup for the Green Bay wide receivers, and it's really a toss-up right now about who's the number 2 guy behind Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed scored a touchdown last week, and he continues to be realistically the number 1 target in this offense. But then you've got 3 guys behind him that are just kind of fluctuating up and down when it comes to the depth chart and really the number of targets they're getting in any given week. Since week 5, Marvin Harrison Jr. has finished as a wide receiver 2 1 time. And he's finished as a wide receiver 1, you guessed it, 1 time. He hasn't been very good over the last several weeks. But there's something about this matchup and the man-to-man coverage that we see the Los Angeles Rams play that makes me feel like Marvin Harrison Jr. could get back into that type of territory this week. A touchdown, 70, 80 receiving yards. I'm really hoping that happens. But we're going to leave him at a medium risk because he hasn't been playing that well as of late. And because of that, I don't want to get overzealous and promise you guys the world for Marvin Harrison when he hasn't been able to deliver already. Jackson Smith-Njigba has put together back-to-back really solid weeks, getting double-digit targets in both of those games. So moving forward, if that continues to happen, he's a top 24 wide receiver every single week. And along with DK Metcalf, he's a low-risk play as well, especially in these type of matchups. Tyler Lockett, kind of the odd man out right now. Is he getting looks? Yes. Is he getting enough to start? No. A.J. Brown has a good matchup this week, and he really has a whole lot of wide receiver 1 upside once again, especially continuing to get the volume as the wide receiver 1 in this offense with Jalen Hurts playing so well. But Devontae Smith, he's hit or miss. The reason you draft Devontae Smith is because you feel like, yes, he's a little risky, but he gives you wide receiver 1 upside every single week. But he only has 2 wide receiver 1 performances this season. In fact, over the last 5 weeks, he's finished as the wide receiver 102, 8, 11, 74, and 55. Does he provide wide receiver 1 upside? Absolutely. But more times than not, he's not giving you anything. The Eagles are allowing the fewest receiving yards to wide receivers right now, but that doesn't mean Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua should not be in your lineups, because maybe they don't have the upside that we saw from them last week, but they still have really safe floors, because in this offense, both of those guys are getting a ton of targets, a ton of looks, and they're making plays. Zay Flowers' target share has dropped a little bit. It's still hovering right at 6 targets per game over the last 3 weeks. But over the last 2 weeks, he's been the wide receiver 50 and 31. He just hasn't put together any of those wide receiver 1 or 2 finishes that we were really becoming accustomed to at the beginning of the season because of that large target share. And considering that the Chargers defense is not going to be the easiest matchup that he has coming up, I don't really love his upside this week. He's going to carry medium risk for me, and the other wide receivers are really not guys that I'm willing to touch. Maybe Zay Flowers can find the end zone. Maybe he can get more than 6 targets this week, but I would really love to see them get him going once again. Yeah, Ladd McConkey has shown some decent upside. Unfortunately, from a fantasy perspective, he really hasn't been finishing as like a high upside or medium wide receiver too, but he's been putting together at least flex weeks for a little bit now. And this Baltimore secondary allows the most fantasy points, receiving touchdowns, and receiving yards to wide receivers. So let's go ahead and head on over to Underdog and check on Ladd McConkey's projection, which currently comes in at what I believe is a very low, 62.5 receiving yards right now. Going up against this defense, Ladd McConkey absolutely should be in your lineup. He's going to be in my underdog lineups, and I'm going higher than that projection. Well, there you have it, Headliner Nation. Hopefully this video has helped you find some guys that you can utilize in your lineup this week if you're having issues with injuries or buys and you need someone to step in. Times are going to be tough during Buymageddon. Stay strong, get a dub. Let's head towards the fantasy playoffs. We're only a couple of weeks away at this point. But for now, Headliner Nation, I'm going to get out of here. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.